documentary trade still relies heavily on paper-based systems where paperwork has to be literally moved from one place to another for processing.
Here to tell us how the digitisation of documentary trade could be a game changer for corporates, banks and customs, we're joined by Mathew, who's the global head of documentary trade at Standard Chartered. Sam, welcome to Sibos TV.
Thank you, Jack.
Now, Sam, why is so much of documentary trade, such as letters of credit and bank guarantees, still paper-based?
Jack, a lot of it is legacy, history. Think of it similarly to the newspaper. 20 years ago, when the internet first came on board, people said, hey, the newspaper is going to be dead. But I still like my newspaper with my morning coffee. So a lot of it has to do with the way banks did trade and finance the trade. Inherently, the importer and the exporter don't trust each other. So the bank plays the role of a trusted intermediary. Now, to act as a trusted intermediary, historically, the evidencing of that performance by the supplier and so on was done basis paper documents. And that works pretty well. So that legacy has continued, and that's the reason why it is so prevalent.
What would you say is the impact of the use of paper-based systems on trade?
So, as you would appreciate, there's about 4 billion worth of documents, or 4 billion documentary pages out there in the trade finance world. So that gives rise to a lot of manual handling, process inefficiencies, obviously cost intensive, but most importantly, it gives rise to potential errors because a lot of data is manually captured from these pages onto digital systems. So highly inefficient, and that systems are legacy.
Right, so given all of that, what is the impact on the banks themselves?
So clearly, as we go into finding more efficiencies, digitization and technologies such as blockchain are knocking on our doors. It has already started happening in other industries. Banks are looking, and clients are looking at ways to digitize this trade. If you think about it, 10 years ago, not many corporates or banks had a chief innovation or a chief digital officer. We would normally talk to a CFO and a CIO. But the Chief Digital and Innovation Officer is a new role that has been there for the last few years now, with the focus that is needed to try and digitize some of these flows. So the banks are looking at how we digitize, both internally, because paper is not going to stop. So we've got to look at how we convert the paper to data at the first point that it touches the bank, but also how we connect to clients in a digital manner so that the paper itself can be eliminated.
And when documentary trade is digitized, what's that going to look like?
Think about this. Think about the experience you have when you walk into a supermarket physically and pick up goods and pay for it with cash versus being on an online marketplace. You click, select what you want into your basket, and you pay for it digitally, right, using your card or whatever e-wallet it is. So I think in the ideal end state, you will have a situation where the importer and the exporter are contracting on the online platform. Whatever the contract calls for is digitally encoded, and the proof of whether shipment has happened, whether the goods have been loaded, all of that will happen digitally, and the importer, exporter, and the banks involved can see all of that digitally. In other words, it will all be in one place with data flowing between the partners as opposed to physical documents flowing. So it ideally should be seamless and therefore bring in a lot of efficiencies.
Okay, so let's hold that thought and just take it a little bit further, because what would a digital system actually allow businesses, banks, and customs to do that they can't do now?
Right. So if you think about it, physical paper today flows from the exporter to his bank, to the importer's bank, to customs, to the importer. Now, if you could digitize that flow end to end, it will bring in a lot of efficiencies in terms of how much time that takes, first of all. Second, the manual errors I talked about earlier would almost be non-existent. So from a risk management and mitigation perspective, the risk of double financing, the risk of fraud, the risk of inadvertently financing a flow that you are not supposed to finance because of sanctions controls, with the paper trail didn't really tell you. All of that risk can be mitigated. So risk mitigation, efficiency, processing costs, and simple turnaround time would be some of the benefits.
Sam, you're based in Singapore. How are some of the countries in Asia digitizing documentary trade at the moment?
Right, Jack, so I talked about corporates and banks having now a chief innovation and a digital officer. So there's clearly a lot of work happening in the industry, both at the client level and the banks level. But there's also a lot of work happening at the regulatory level. So you'll find that regulators such as the Singapore government is getting on to create a national trade platform domestically. Hong Kong is trying to do the same. Bank of Thailand announced something similar. So there's a lot of work happening by the regulatory bodies to see how we can digitize, first of all, in the domestic economy, and then connect the dots cross-border.
When you take the much bigger picture, we know that trade patterns, they're changing dramatically. You have rising protectionism in some parts of the world and also greater inter-region trade in Asia. So how is this going to impact on the digitization of documentary trade with that bigger backdrop in mind?
Right. So, look, everybody is looking for efficiencies. At the end of the day, processing costs and where trade margins are today, also with the tariffs rising and potential protectionism coming into a lot of the regions that we operate in, everybody is looking for efficiency. So there'll be, I think, larger south-south flows compared to large inter-regional flows. There'll be more regional flows going forward that will be driven by a lot of the large consumption economies like India and China, for example. So I think open account trade driven by domestic consumption, domestic supply chain is going to become a lot more prevalent. And those flows lend itself to a lot more digitization than some of the letter of credit-based flows.
Certainly an exciting space to keep watching. Sam Mathew, thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.